viruses induced by mass media news programming. No BS here, just the facts.
And now we present to you America's quintessential iconoclastic anomaly.
Wow.
In talk radio, your host, Joe Cristiano.
Welcome, everyone, to Liberty Talk Radio, America's libertarian voice, broadcasting from our studio in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to around the world. I'm your host, Joe Cristiano, and this is your antidote to popular talk radio. Folks, it's time for us to take back control of our government now before this bureaucratic, oversized, and self-serving federal government starves us of our property, our freedom, our rights, our liberty. But to do this, we must shed conventional thinking regarding our political structure. We need to be revolutionaries in thought, dissidents in action. Only after we recognize what our government is doing to our freedom and our Constitution will we start taking it back. And this program is just about that. Today we're pleased that Dr. James Lark is returning as our guest. He's the chairman of the board of directors of the Advocates for Self-Government. He has served as a regional representative on the Libertarian National Committee, as well as a national chair of the Libertarian Party in 2000 and 2002. Jim is frequently invited to give an address on college campuses entitling Warning, Government-Mandated Safety Measures May Be Hazardous to Your Health. I love that title. Today we'll be discussing, I guess, the state of affairs. I think what James will do today for me is maybe calm down some of my frustrations that I'm having about this whole election process, and maybe he can make me feel better and I'll sleep better at night. During our live broadcast, please call in 646-652-4620. That's 646-652-4620. And if you want to become part of the conversation, ask a question or make a comment, press the one button so we know you want to break in. All right? Jim, welcome back to Liberty Talk Radio.
Joe, thank you for having me on again. I actually thought it was you who was going to calm me down. I don't know that I'm going to be able to do much for anybody. I'm as frustrated and concerned as anyone about the election going forward.
You know, and I know there's nothing we can do about it because you're fighting the mafia, you know. Here we have a candidate who is eligible in every state in the union. And the mainstream media, whether it be ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox News, whatever, you name them, rarely will they even mention his name or acknowledge his existence as a candidate. Now, that in itself says the system is rigged. If you don't vote for either Trump, who's a disaster, or Hillary, who's probably more of a disaster, I think, there's no one to vote for. And I don't understand why they do not bring in Gary Johnson into the equation. Well, you also have Stein. Also, she should be brought into the equation as well. If she has a possibility of winning because she's registered in, I don't think she's in all 50 states, but she's in enough states that she could possibly win. And then those few opportunities that Gary Johnson has on mainstream television, he comes across so unenthusiastic, almost like he wants to go to sleep on you. And I really wish he would be a little bit more emphatic and tell us why he's running, what's wrong with the entire system, and why they should start listening to the Libertarian Party rather than being so nice about it. Now, I'm sorry, I'm lambasting everybody today because I'm frustrated. Please help me out.
Well, I think that it's a shame that the American people have not really had the opportunity to investigate much more carefully the choices they have. One of the biggest frustrations that libertarians, Greens, third-party people in general, independents have, is that the prestige press has largely decided that they're going to cover only the Democratic and Republican Party candidates, with the usual exception of the obligatory interview every so often. I think that Gary Johnson and others have a lot to say. I think Gary Johnson and his campaign raise a lot of questions that, even if you don't agree with the libertarian perspective, you would agree that these questions should be raised, and that both Mr. Trump and Mrs. Clinton try desperately to avoid answering some of these questions, particularly what is America's role in the world. They're very good at making pronouncements about, say, making America great, but they don't actually talk about what that means. And for example, our foreign policy, we're involved in all sorts of places where it's not at all clear that America's national interests or the protection of Americans is involved. You don't hear either Mrs. Clinton or Mr. Trump answering questions about important issues. And I think that having Governor Johnson in the debates would have allowed proper questions about our role to be asked and hopefully answered. So it is extremely frustrating when you have good quality candidates. You have, in the case of the Libertarian Party ticket, 2 former governors who are not really allowed to be part of that debate.
Yeah. And especially since they were former governors and they did very well. I mean, they were very well respected. You think they would be given some respect, and they're not. And what bothers me about the mainstream candidates, both Clinton and Trump, but probably both equally, is that they talk about the symptoms, but they don't want to talk about the cause. You know, they talk about ISIS and how they're going to fix ISIS or immigration, and how they're going to fix immigration. Well, they can't fix or they can't address those because they won't address the cause of those problems. I'm an open borders guy, and I can make a damn good argument for open borders, but it's just not a matter of opening your borders. First, we have to stop bombing everyone. Secondly, we have to stop telling everyone what to do. You know, and we have a lot of things we have to unravel before we open our border. Then we can have open borders. As far as I'm concerned, if you come over here, you abide by our rules. If we go there, we abide by your rules. What difference does it make whether you have a fence or not? Or, I mean, to me, I'm sorry, I'm ranting and raving, and I'm frustrated. Help me out, please, before I have a headache.
Again, I think that so many Americans are frustrated that many people are ranting and raving about the very bad choices we have. I think from the perspective of limited government, individual liberty, personal responsibility, it really doesn't make an enormous difference whether it is Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton who's elected. Liberty is going to take a hit in this election. And I think that it's important for those of us who do believe in the libertarian perspective, individual liberty and personal responsibility, to get out there and to try to, at least to the extent we can, show people that they do have a choice if they don't wish to vote for increasing government, if they don't wish to vote for increasing America's involvement in places where we really don't have any business. If you don't think the United States should be the world's policeman, if you don't think that government should basically run your lives, there are alternatives. Unfortunately, the prestige press in particular is not really doing much to ask the proper questions of Mrs. Clinton and Mr. Trump, and to allow other people perhaps to answer those questions.
You know, it's kind of interesting that the federal government would be reluctant to send federal troops to one of our states to resolve a problem. But yet we'll take federal troops and ship them over to a sovereign nation 7,000 miles away to solve a purported problem. But no one sees that. Does anyone not think anymore? I went to a meeting this morning. It's a think tank meeting. And there was a young fella. He couldn't have been more than 19, 20 years old. And he hasn't graduated college yet. And he said, I heard about you guys. I wanted to come here because I wanted to see the way you guys think. I want to learn how to think. And he was a brilliant kid, you know. And he was one of the ones that asking, you know, he wanted to know the cause of it. Why this? Why that? This is something we don't hear from our people today. We don't hear from the young people today. College students take everything on the surface. I don't understand our thinking at all.
Well, it's, you know, if you want me to go into ranting and raving, get me started on the American education system, the problems that we have in terms of education. And by the way, I don't want to put all the blame on the actual structural education problem. I mean, ultimately, the problem starts with the parents who have children who don't essentially encourage an atmosphere of critical thinking in the home. We shouldn't expect our public schools or schools in general, whether public or private, to basically do the job that parents are responsible for.
Correct.
Anyway, the major point is that I find increasingly that a lot of the young people today seem to lack a lot of the critical thinking skills. Now, one has to be careful when it says that. The older generation is always inclined to look at the younger generation as not being as good as we were. But my gut feeling is that there is a genuine change in terms of the intellectual curiosity of young people. A lot of young people just don't seem to be as thoughtful and as willing to ask hard and perhaps painful questions as earlier generations were. Now, maybe that's unfair, but I do see some bad signs. On the other hand, it should be noted that a lot of the bright, talented young people today, the creme de la creme of bright young intellectuals, many of them increasingly are of libertarian disposition. They take a general libertarian perspective.
Well, you know, the prostitutes themselves, when they have these debates, I hate calling them debates because they're not, and Trump comes up with saying that we're going to eliminate Obamacare and replace it. And has anyone yet asked him with what? I haven't heard that question. And it would be the first obvious question, with what? What are you going to do? But I don't think he's ever been challenged on that. Has he? Well, I have Sally here. I think she has the answer. Sally, you have the answer to that?
I don't think we care.
Okay. All right.
As long as he gets replaced.
Oh, you don't care what it is, right?
Well,
even if you have to nurse my wounds, right?
Perhaps, but Dr. Lark will know better. And I have a question too, Dr. Lark, about the kids that you talk to, the young people. I have a niece who's in college. She's 20 years old, and I don't know where to begin with her. Right now she's headed to the polls to vote for Hillary, and I don't want to see that happen. But I find that you have to give an awful lot of history. She doesn't have anything to go on. I have 40 so years of different presidents, different campaigns. I can fill her in on a lot of information she needs to know. Do you have to spend about 30 minutes just to educate? I know you're speaking to some students tonight. How long do you spend on the kids with history?
Well, it depends upon the circumstances. It depends upon the forum. Unfortunately, you're absolutely right in the sense that one of the biggest tasks for people who believe in limited government is basically to disabuse people of some very bad history. When I give instruction to young libertarians who want to go off on college campuses and try to explain and promote these ideas, I inform them that in many cases, the arguments they will have will not be about the basic moral perspective of libertarianism. In other words, don't initiate force against other people, honor your contracts. It's kind of hard to object to that, actually. What you find is that most of the arguments with which you have in other cases of people trying to understand the libertarian perspective, the argument you will have is about some very badly caricatured history. People have some very, frankly, some very bad notions about what happened to the poor in the Industrial Revolution or what happened in the United States during the Great Depression. It's very hard to overcome poorly learned or badly understood history. So, and that does take a long time. It also takes the effort on the part of the student to want to learn. And learning is hard and learning is dangerous, because you may find that what you thought you knew, you don't know at all. What you thought was right was actually wrong. And finding students who are willing to take the time and trouble to actually get their hands around history as it actually happened, many young people today just don't seem to have that drive to learn.
Right, thank you.
Well, why do you think that the Libertarian Party... I have feedback. Wow. Do you know why that's happening? I still hear it. I hear myself coming back again. Okay, I'm sorry, Jim. We just had... Well, I'm still having feedback. Okay, I think I'm okay now. All right. Jim, why do you think that the Libertarian Party is so attractive to so many college students, you know, when we all agree that they don't think as they used to think in college many years ago? It seems like they're more superficial.
My seat of the pants reaction is that basically the libertarian perspective is basically a very naturally attractive perspective. The idea of letting people live their lives their way as long as they don't hurt others, as long as they honor their contracts, as long as they don't violate the like rights of their neighbors, it just has a natural attraction. And I think that many young people, because of a certain degree of idealism that they have, perhaps they haven't seen how the world actually works at times. Perhaps the libertarian perspective has a particular attraction to them because they basically want to be able to live their lives without interference. And I think that as we learn how to explain these ideas in better fashion, I think we'll do an even better job with young people. But there's a countervailing tendency, and that is that many young people want things such as free education. They think that education can be made free. They think that the government can provide health care essentially without various bad side effects when government gets involved in the control of health care. And so you have these countervailing tendencies. On the one hand, the libertarian perspective, I think, is naturally attractive. On the other hand, many young people don't understand how wealth is created. They don't understand that when government gets involved in various affairs, even with the best of intentions, government can basically cause problems. So while there's a natural attractiveness to our ideas, in many cases, the countervailing currents, the idea of free stuff, or what appears to be free, I think in some cases swamps their interest in the general libertarian perspective.
Yeah. Do you know what Gary Johnson's strategy is right now? I mean, obviously he's not leading in the polls. And what's your guesstimate of independents going in there or undecideds and not voting for Hillary and not voting for Trump, but deciding, I'm going to pull the lever for Gary. He's not going to win, so what the heck, but I don't like the other two. And Gary Johnson actually getting a larger portion of the vote or disrupting it so that they'll have to have a runoff of some sort.
I don't have a direct pipeline to either Governor Johnson or to his campaign team. So pretty much what I know is what's either released by the campaign generally or is distributed via friends of mine who perhaps are in direct contact with the campaign team. I think that Governor Johnson is simply trying to make the point whenever he has the opportunity to get a microphone in front of him that you do have a choice, and that voting for what you want is actually a better choice than voting for the lesser of evils. The Libertarian Party has had to deal for many years with the so-called wasted vote syndrome, that people will look at Tweedledum and Tweedledummer and decide, I have to vote for one of them. Otherwise, if I vote for what I want, I'm going to end up with what I most despise. And it's not for me to tell people for whom they should vote. I actually try to be very careful when I talk to people who believe in individual liberty and personal responsibility. I try to make sure they understand my crystal ball broke a long time ago. I don't know what the best path is. I have decided for my own purposes that voting for what I want, voting for a libertarian candidate, is the better way of going. But I can understand how someone might look at Donald Trump and say, this guy, if he's elected, it's the fall of the Republic, or they can look at Hillary Clinton and say, if she's elected, it's the fall of the Republic. And they may be right in both cases, I might add. I can understand how people of goodwill might decide, if I vote for what I want, I'm going to end up with what I most despise or what I most fear. So I can't tell them, you have to vote Libertarian. That's the only way to move things forward, because I can't say that it is. However, I think that for very good reasons, voting for what you want, voting for a Libertarian candidate is actually going to send a much bigger signal, given that it's very unlikely your particular vote is actually going to be determinative. You send a much bigger signal by giving Governor Johnson 5%, 10%, or more. So hopefully people will decide that voting Libertarian is the best way to go, but I will understand if people choose differently.
Now, I heard that if one of the candidates does not receive a certain number of percentage of the votes, then you have a runoff. Am I right? Or if
Well, of course, to be elected as president, you have to receive a majority in the electoral college, and if there's no majority in the electoral college, then something else happens, and so we will see. Right now, if I had to place a bet, I think the fact that we don't really have a presidential election, we have 51 presidential elections in the various states. I think that's going to be very difficult for anyone other than Mrs. Clinton to get a majority, and I dare say I think there's a very good chance she will get it. But funny things have happened in the United States, so maybe enough people will decide they just can't stomach. Also, we're still far enough away in terms of the election cycle that one more interesting leaked document from WikiLeaks may change the dynamics. There's an awful lot of stuff that's come out about Mrs. Clinton and and her administration, her friends, that people haven't really focused on because of the Donald Trump, his interesting problems. Once people start focusing upon the information that's come out about Hillary Clinton, it might drive her numbers down somewhat. Not so much because people will actually switch, that those who are going to vote for Hillary are going to vote for someone else. Right. It may be that it'll depress the people who might normally vote for her to just not go out, or might normally vote for a Democrat, not to show up at the polls. And if that's the case, we could see something very interesting. For whatever it's worth, I tend to think that Donald Trump's positives are understated. I think there are a lot more people who will vote for him than are showing up in the polls, simply because he has such now a bad reputation among many that they just don't want to come out and say, well, I'd rather vote for Donald Trump than for Hillary Clinton. So I tend to think that the number of people who will vote for Mrs. Clinton is somewhat overstated, and the number of people who will vote for Mr. Trump is understated.
Yeah. Now, if Gary Johnson fools everyone and gets a much larger percentage of the vote, he still may not have any votes in the electoral college. Is that true?
Oh, that's true. He could actually get a very substantial popular vote and not receive any votes in the electoral college. Yeah. So I would, in fact, frankly, if I had to place a bet, if you put a gun to my head and forced me, I would be very surprised if Governor Johnson received electoral votes. That would be a tremendous accomplishment if he were to do so.
Yeah. Now, I want to move over to the economy. I always had the feeling that no one in his right mind would run for elected office at this time. I mean, we're due for a recession. I mean, if you look at historically, we're due for a recession. The next one's going to be a doozy, because the patient that was dying in 2008 and 2003 and 1999, we kept on injecting with morphine, and they kept on popping up and saying, oh, geez, I feel great. Well, the patient now is basically dead and the morphine's not working. There are many, and we've had several main economists, worldwide financial people, very well respected, academically as well as financially, say that a recession is coming. It's going to be a doozy, and it won't be a recession. It'll be a very dark depression, worse than 1930. Now, do you think for a second that maybe those people who would have run for office are sitting back saying, even if I can win, I don't want to win, because I don't want to be the head of state when everything falls. They know what's happening. They know better than we do that the whole system may collapse, and there is nothing that they can do about it. You think that has any validity at all?
I honestly don't know. My impression is that the people who think that they could do a good job as president, I would think that actually this time around, given that they would have looked at Mrs. Clinton and they would have seen that the Republicans were badly divided, that would have actually been more of an invitation for them to try to run. However, Again, the point that you're making that perhaps people looking at the clouds on the horizon economically may have decided that, no, this is not the time, it's better to wait until later. That very well may be the case. I personally don't know of anyone in the political sphere, someone who I think might have actually had a chance of gaining traction, who has articulated that sort of view, that they say that the near term is sufficiently bad that they wouldn't step forward and run. But again, it's quite possible that that effect has actually taken place. But if it has, I don't know about it.
Okay. Well, you know, here we sit. We're near $20 trillion current year debt. Our long-term, you know, the example that I give when people say 20 trillion, I said, you know, if you go to a bank and you borrow $50,000, and let's assume you get zero interest, just for the sake of simplicity, and you pay $10,000 a year over 5 years. And I asked you, how much do you owe the bank? What would you say? They say, well, 50,000. I said, well, the government says you only owe 10,000. And this is what we say. We say the current year's debt. Well, if the current year's debt is discounting the other 40,000 in my hypothetical example that you owe the bank. I said, we owe, and Professor Kutlikoff, you know, Lawrence Kutlikoff was on the show just last Thursday. And when was it? Yeah, I guess it was last Thursday, you know. And he says it's around approaching $1 quadrillion our total debt. And let's not forget the 6.5 trillion that they forgot to put in the books. You know, they just made an entry error. You know, I do that all the time with 6.5 trillion. It happens all the time. And so with all of this, it looks like the patient is dead. We're making believe the patient is still breathing. And there is absolutely no way that we can get out of this. And would you want to be president at this particular point in time?
Well, considering the fact that we're likely to get either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, I guess I'd be willing to give it a whack. I think that would be a better alternative for the benefit of my country. If you mean, do I think that we aren't going to be looking at some severe problems? No, I think we've already been looking at severe problems. The fact that we've had a monetary policy over the last several years that basically have tried to keep interest rates from doing their proper job, which is helping us equilibrate the present with the future. I think we've seen much slower growth in the United States and in the world because we have people who think that they know how to run a monetary system, which is most unfortunate. So it's not, I would agree, it's not the best time to be president, because you will have to be president at a time where you're going to need to take a lot of corrective action in terms of getting rid of government spending, reducing the size and scope of government. And that's going to be painful. I don't care what the long-term benefits will be. It's going to be painful in the near term.
Yeah. Well, I wonder how they're going to afford, the reason why I brought the subject up is I don't know how they plan to afford all of these massive programs that they're proposing, you know, when they're giving their election speeches, and how they're going to make healthcare even more affordable and more available, and how we're going to defeat ISIS, you know, and although we created ISIS and now we're killing, I mean, it makes no sense. They're proposing more and more with less and less, and everyone seems to be agreeing with it, except for maybe a few libertarians here and there, and it's driving us nuts.
Well, there is, I guess, a benefit to magical thinking in that it perhaps allows you to avoid the pain of the realization that the real world doesn't necessarily operate the way that you would like. My feeling is that there's just an awful lot of economic illiteracy out there, and that there are plenty of people who think that you can engage in the sort of actions that our government and other governments have engaged in and not have to pay a piper. Unfortunately, in many cases, people are able to, precisely because they can shove the burdens of their spending onto future generations, they can basically continue on until the merry-go-round stops. And unfortunately, in many cases, the people who saddled us with the debt, the people who burdened us with this incredible expansion of government, they're going to be dead by the time the bill comes due.
Yeah. Well, I'm living forever, so I'm gonna suffer. You know that. Well,
Yeah, I wasn't planning to die, so I know what you mean.
well, if in fact Gary Johnson came into office, his plan is to reduce the size of government, because right now there are more government employees than there are in manufacturing in the United States. Now that's a recipe for utter disaster. But the mainstream candidates are going to even distort that proportion further. Gary Johnson will do the reverse. We have more people relying on government than ever, and that's the only reason why goods and services continue to flow, because people are getting money to place back into the system, and of course it's all printed money. It's not earned money. If he stops that merry-go-round, doesn't the whole system immediately fall apart? I mean, don't we have like instant depression the day he announces that these programs are going to end?
I don't think so. I think you're definitely going to have dislocations. You cannot have a system which has the sort of that plays the game the way it does. You cannot have such a system change overnight without dislocation. There are going to be there's going to be plenty of pain. You can't have the sort of system we've had over the last 50, 60, 70 years, but particularly the last, say, 8 or 9 years regarding our current government's programs with respect to monetary policy. You can't slam on the brakes without some sort of dislocation. The point is it better to go ahead and face the pain now or wait until the pain is much greater? And unfortunately, I think that there's a natural tendency on the part of people to say, let's put it off. Let me mention, by the way, I'm told, I don't speak Polish, but at the time of Solidarity, when things were coming to a head in Poland, when the Polish communist government was starting to lose support and people were starting to realize the problems, there was a phrase used in Poland that translated "situation fatal but not serious." And the idea was that everybody knew the system was going to collapse at some point. But since the collapse was not imminent, it wasn't right there in your face, you could say tomorrow. We'll deal with it tomorrow. And so I think that describes in many ways what we now have, that there will be a day of reckoning, but it's not right there staring you in the face, or at least it's not staring most people in the face. And thus, it's so much easier to say, let's deal with that tomorrow. And eventually tomorrow is going to come, and it's going to be very unpleasant.
Yeah, like what was that movie, Gone with the Wind, What was that saying? Worry about that tomorrow,
yes.
Right. It seems like that's what we do. We're like gone with the wind, and it looks like our whole nation's gone with the wind. Well, if we can't raise the interest rate, because then the U.S. government will find it even more difficult to pay back its debts, and with the Chinese yuan becoming part of the group of nations or currencies in the special drawing rights of the IMF, I think it's 9.5%. Isn't there a lessening of influence of the U.S. dollar in international trade? And should this continue, will we not see an influx of dollars in the trillions of dollars come flowing back to the United States, placing the dollar in jeopardy and maybe even collapsing our whole economic system?
That's a possibility. I can't discount it completely. My gut feeling is again, we'll see some dislocations to the extent that America does not have a sound dollar, to the extent that our monetary policy, our fiscal policies tend to erode the value of the dollar. Yes, you're going to see dislocations. I don't think that we are likely to see anything as catastrophic as you're suggesting. Remember, depressions are very expensive. And even the people who are doing, in my opinion, who are acting badly, and their actions are moving us in the wrong direction, even they eventually will, I think, be mugged by reality, and they'll have to realize if we actually do have a full-blown, honest-to-God depression, that it's going to be extremely unpleasant. And so I think that while, as I said, any sort of reckoning we're going to see is going to have some painful side effects, I don't see a general sort of catastrophe on the horizon. Now, contrary to rumor, I have been wrong before, so always take what I'm saying with the appropriate size grain of salt.
Well, we never know. And I assume whatever is going to happen will be a surprise to everyone. I mean, will never be what someone expects. It never is. It has never been that way with me. You know, I always anticipate one thing, and that may not happen. Something else, and sometimes it's even worse. So we never know. But
well, you know the old saying, Joe, that those who know don't tell, and those who tell don't know. So I suspect there are people out there who they have a much better way of predicting what the problems will be under certain circumstances, certain contingencies, but they're not necessarily going to tell the rest of us. And the people who are the ones who are proclaiming most loudly, in many cases, they don't necessarily know what's going on. So there may be plenty of people out there who actually do know, but they're the incentive for them to tell us is not necessarily a very strong one.
Where I can wrap my head around is that we're one of the most, in dollar terms, we're the most indebted nation in the world. I guess Japan is worse than us relative to GDP. But we know this is not unsustainable. There is no way out. And negative interest rates exasperates the situation. Then we have people running for office who want to give more money away and even expand our influence around the world militarily. And it's like I'm listening to a bunch of lunatics planning the world, and no one's screaming, other than me and you and maybe a few other people, and saying, oh yeah, that's good, USA, USA, you know, all that stuff. And I said, I'm living in a nut house. I mean, nothing seems to make sense. I cannot cite one thing that our mainstream candidates are saying that makes any sense whatsoever on how we're going to create a better world for tomorrow.
Well, I certainly haven't heard anything from them, and I would imagine that if either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump is elected, we're going to see government get larger. We're going to see government become more intrusive. We're going to see, in the name of cleaning up previous problems, government will create more problems. And I think that over the long haul, I actually tend to be pretty optimistic about the future of liberty, the future of the libertarian perspective. But the long haul can be a very long time from now. Yeah. And it very well may be that it has to get worse before it gets better. We should note, by the way, one of my constant boilerplate comments is that as much as I dislike Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, they're not the disease. The disease is our friends and neighbors who put them in office, who don't want to consider, or perhaps are not capable of considering, the fact that the policies, the programs that these people advocate are actually going to make things, on balance, worse for the vast majority of people. Now, there will be people who will be advantaged. Hillary Clinton, in my opinion, is a crony capitalist. She can sound very socialist at times.
Yeah, right, I agree.
She is perfectly willing to engage in the use of government to benefit people with whom she's on a friendly basis. Same thing with Donald Trump. So there will be beneficiaries of these government, this expansion of the size and scope of government. But I think I think the rest of us peasants are going to be paying we're going to be paying for the freight. And I'm over the near term, I'm not at all optimistic. Again, it's possible that the worse the better. But I think the near term, we're going to see government getting larger. And not only with respect to involvement in economic matters, I think we're going to see government increasingly involved in all manner of things, such as healthcare. I think that the path for healthcare in this country is not going to be in the free market direction. Or I hope it will be, but there's signs that the current problems with Obamacare are going to lead to an effort essentially to get rid of Obamacare and replace it with single payer of some type or some stripe. So, and if that happens, by the way, this country is in bad shape. If we already have a substantial amount of old age pension relief provided by government, if we have health care essentially becoming the province of government, it's going to be hard to recover from that, and it will take a long time.
Yeah. Do you sense that any of the states might make rumbles regarding secession movements if Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump become our?
Well, that you'll see rumble. You see them all the time. Unfortunately, I don't know that there's anything that can really be done. Professor Lino Graglia, who was, I think, from Brooklyn, and you could tell by virtue of his accent. He was a law professor at the University of Texas, and he used to have this line about by 1865, the South had become convinced of the North's superior constitutional argument regarding secession. So I don't think you're going to see much in the way of any sort of serious efforts to change the constellation of American statehood. And you'll hear grumbles, just as we heard substantial grumbles in 2004, when various people said upon the re-election of President Bush that they were moving to Canada. By the way, many of those people, I would have helped pay for the cab to get them.
Well, I've already.
The problem is that they're not serious. I mean, I was hoping they'd leave.
I've already put my wife on notice. I said, let me tell you something. I said, if Texas secedes from the Union, I said, we're close neighbors. If we don't follow them, we're moving. I said, you're on notice. And I quite frankly, I mean that. I mean it literally. If Texas seceded from the Union, I would shut down the studio. I got 2 businesses here. I'd sell them or shut them down, and I'd move. I mean, that's how disgusted I am with this whole system. I really am.
Texas would, I think, don't mess with Texas. I think that if Texas were to secede, there'd be a lot of people who'd be flooding in, singing, the eyes of Texas are upon you. And so you would see, I think you would see an enormous burst of economic activity.
Yeah. I lived in Texas, and I loved their attitude. I just loved their attitude. Anyway, what strategy are you familiar with that Gary Johnson is going to use in the next couple of weeks? Is there anything that we're going to hear from him that you know of, or any?
If he has any major surprises or any programs, I haven't been made aware of them, or at least perhaps I have, and I just didn't see it. I should note that I just got back yesterday from Bulgaria. I was giving a lecture to the European Students for Liberty Conference in Sofia, Bulgaria. The previous weekend, I was in the Czech Republic giving a lecture at the European Students for Liberty Conference. So it is possible that I missed the memo, but I'm not aware of any sort of major systematic approach that Governor Johnson and Governor Weld will be using. I hope they have one, but I'm not sure what it is. Unfortunately, again, much to my chagrin, the prestige press, and by that I refer to New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN. The prestige press has pretty much made a decision that we're going to focus, we being they're going to focus on Trump versus Clinton. And third-party candidates, independent candidates are just not going to get much traction. My hope is that you might see something again from WikiLeaks in terms of something that points out that there really are smoking guns concerning Mrs. Clinton. Donald Trump has already shown that he is, shall we say, an interesting fellow who really shouldn't be let loose on the White House. So maybe something will happen at the last minute. I wouldn't bet on it.
Hey, maybe we'll learn that Hillary Clinton is married to Donald Trump. That'll settle that. That'll solve our problem, wouldn't it?
Well, maybe that was Hillary's revenge on Bill. I'll show you.
That's right. Julia Sally, do you have a question or a comment?
Just a comment. On the way to the studio today, Gary Johnson was on Neil Cavuto on Fox News. So
Well, I think Governor Johnson will continue. I mean, there will be people in the media who will give him an opportunity to explain his position, and you never know. It's quite possible that something precipitous will happen, and that Governor Johnson will all of a sudden draw a fair amount of attention. Again, who knows how many more revelations there are out there waiting to come forward. But again, I think you have to evaluate things as you see them. And right now, I just don't think that it's very likely that Governor Johnson is going to gain a lot of traction. Perhaps it's possible that we will see an interesting drop-off in terms of participation by those who might normally vote Republican or those who might normally vote Democrat. I think the Republicans are in a tremendous jam here. Yeah. They have a candidate who is very unpopular with many Republicans. Many Republicans just simply will not support Trump. The Republicans have both houses of the United States, the Congress, and I think they're genuinely concerned that they're going to lose at least one of those houses. And if they lose both of the houses, if you have Democrats running both houses of the Congress and in the White House, that's not a good thing. Places like New Zealand all of a sudden start looking a lot more attractive.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions, Sally? That's it. Okay. Well, what suggestions would you have for the average citizen if Trump or Clinton become elected? Should they prepare for anything? Should they do anything differently, or should they just live life as they have been, or what should they do?
Well, again, it's funny how sometimes you think that when an event occurs, you think that these are the consequences that are likely to ensue, and many of them do ensue, but sometimes you're surprised. It's possible. I would think I tend to be very keen on right to keep and bear arms issues. I have what one might call a robust interpretation of the Second Amendment and the right to keep and bear arms. I think if Mrs. Clinton is elected, she will, in various ways, try to lessen the ability of Americans to fulfill that right to keep and bear arms. But whether she'll actually be able to take anything in terms of major steps, it may actually be that if the Republicans are facing Mrs. Clinton in the White House, that they will finally grow a spine and decide we're just not going to go along with these liberty-reducing methods. So it's possible that we may actually see some good things coming about. I certainly, if I plan to keep my powder dry, no possible pun or double entendre intended, regardless of who's elected, I want to make sure that I'm not in debt. I want to make sure that in looking forward, of course, I have some sort of means of protection for my assets against increasing predation by the government. I might be more inclined to make some charitable contributions, perhaps to make sure that for the time being I'm able to take advantage of perhaps the tax deductions that are coming about because of those. So there are several things that you should, of course, keep your eyes on. But unfortunately, as I said, regardless of whether it's Mrs. Clinton or Mr. Trump, I think we're going to see government in the short term getting larger, and its appetite will grow.
I see. Well, Jim, where the witching hour is here, I want to thank you so much for being our guest. You really are one of my favorite guests. I love having you on the show. I do hope you will accept our invitation to return at a later date, give us an update, and of course, maybe right after the election and see what's going on.
Well, perhaps we can cry in each other's beer.
Okay.
Joe, all you have to do is just stick a mic in front of my ugly mug, and I'll be happy to talk. I hope that your listeners find what I have to say to be worthy of their time and attention.
Oh, I'm sure they do. And thank you so much for being on our show. I look forward to speaking with you again.
Joe, the pleasure's mine. Take care.
Thank you. Folks, this is the end of today's program. We'd like to thank our sponsors for the financial support, and we'd like to thank you for listening in. You can further the cause of liberty by recommending this program to your friends, and let us hear from you. Our email address is comments@libertytalkradio.com. Remember, you're either allowing your liberties to be taken away or you're striving to protect them. Unfortunately, there is no middle ground. Until next time, this is Joe Cristiano. You've been listening to Liberty Talk Radio. Stay well. Stay tuned.